Hey, everybody. Welcome back to Popular Music Books in Process, our first event of 2022. As always, we're a collaboration between the Journal of Popular Music Studies, which has put out a new issue since we last gathered, IASPM US, and the Pop Conference, which announced in the last day or so that it will be entirely virtual this year. I want to thank my co-organizers, Carl Wilson, who you'll see in a little bit, and Kimberly Mack. And note that next week in the series, because of Martin Luther King Day, will be happening on Tuesday rather than Monday, with a couple of presentations on mainstreams and commodification. Liz Perbilski, Sonic Sovereignty, Global Hip Hop, and the Shifting Popular Music Mainstream, joined by Alexandra Vizi with her book in progress, Becoming X, Collaborative Merchandise and the Gender Politics of Self-Commodification. But for today, our theme is country music and country queerness, country gender, revisionist books that sort of push at different boundaries of country music's definition. And we have three presenters, all with books that are due to come out over the next year. So we're seeing sort of how one of the most vibrant areas of popular music writing is going to be developing in the year to come. And so our three presenters today, Marissa Moss, Shana Goldin-Perschbacher, and Stacy Easton. I want to just quickly read to you from each of their bios. Marissa Moss, based in Nashville, not far from me in East Nashville, writes for Rolling Stone, NPR, Billboard, Entertainment Weekly. In 2018, she received the Rolling Stone Chet Flippo Award for Excellence in Country Music Journalism. And then the next year, Nashville Scene named her in its Best of Nashville issue, their Best Music Reporter. And so there's quite a bit of anticipation for May, when her book, Her Country, How the Women of Country Music Reinvented Themselves and the Industry to Become the Success Story They Were Never Supposed to Be, will come out on Henry Holt and Company. So welcome, Marissa. Shana Goldin-Perschbacher is an assistant professor of music studies at Temple University's Boyer College of Music and Dance. So she's joining us from Philadelphia. She specializes in popular and folk music and identity, using a variety of methods. And the book has coming out is called Queer Country. It comes out in March on University of Illinois Press. Her work covers musicians like Jeff Buckley, Bjork, Michelle Ndegeocello, for all sorts of journals, popular music, women in music, new literary history, books like the Oxford Handbook of Music and Queerness, Oh Boy, Masculinities in Popular Music. And she's won the Marcia Herndon Award from the Society for Ethnomusicology. So in classic PMBiP fashion, we are going across the boundaries of journalism and academia today. And our final person is really in both worlds. Stacy Easton, coming to us from, is it fair to say Toronto? Hamilton is connected to, or am I just, oh man, my Canadian ignorance is showing immediately. All right, Stacy.
Give it 5 years and it will be.
Okay, fair enough. Hamilton-based critic, academic and visual artist who's written for NPR, CBC, Public Books, and The Atlantic, who amazingly has 3 different books in the process of emerging into the world, because why write just one? The one for today that they'll be talking about, University of Texas Press's Why So-and-So Matters series. Stacy's writing Why Tammy Wynette Matters. Alongside of that, they're also writing a porn Künstlerroman for Coach House Books and a 33 1/3 volume on Dolly Parton's White Limousine. And at the same time, pursuing a PhD degree, having achieved candidacy, congratulations, in critical disability studies.
No, I haven't. That's been missed.
At York University.
So that's a lie, and I apologize. Forgive my integrity.
Oh man. Okay, fair enough. Print the legend, Stacy. Print the legend. Okay, no. All right. For today, I think we're going to have Stacy present first, followed by Shana, followed by Marissa. Then we'll have a little bit of a Q&A between them. We'll open it up for questions and comments from everyone in attendance. Our chat function is right there right now. We encourage people to record their comments, which we'll share with the presenters afterwards, the minute they have those thoughts. And if you realize you have a question you'd like to ask it in the chat right away, but we'll hold off on answering those questions till later. And that's for the presenters as well. Hold off on answering questions in the chat till we get to the Q&A part. The other way only lies madness. All right, so with all of that tucked away, I think I have filibustered long enough. We have a great crowd in the participants thing. Stacy, please take it away.
Deep breaths. Scroll up. Tammy Wynette grew up in very poor in rural Alabama, but her grandparents who helped raise her might have come into some money in the end. Parton and Lynn have suggested they were much poorer than her. She might have picked cotton in her childhood, but later there was debate about exactly how much she picked. She talked about having been a beautician and a barmaid in her 20s, but she was singing on television at the same time, and it's uncertain about how much time she spent really on either career. She might have had a beautician's license for her entire life, but she might not have. It was important to her image that her audience believed that she did. She had 5 husbands. Upal Bird, the first, committed her to a hospital where she suffered early and crude ECT, electroconvulsive therapy. Her second husband, Don Chappell, was a songwriter who worked for her, then for George Jones, and then for Ray Price. Her marriage to Chappell might have been one of commercial convenience more than true love. The story goes that Jones broke apart that marriage to Chappell with a boozy arrogance, denying her autonomy, never a good way to start. Their partnership is often described in euphemisms, Jones and Wynette, stormy or tempestuous or troubled, tempestuous. They fail to express the genuine horror of the reality of their lives. Jones and Wynette made genius music together. Wynette made some of her best work about Jones, and Jones' best work was about Wynette. But for 6 years, they enacted a Southern Gothic version of Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf, except with more money and weirder land deals. Martha and George never bought 40 acres in suburban Nashville, nor built a theme park about their egos. Then there was Michael Tomlin, who sort of worked in real estate and sort of wrote songs. It didn't take long for Annette to realize that she was investing a lot of money for not much return, and she left him. I don't write about it here, but there was also, in the meantime, a Burt Reynolds phase. Who among us hasn't? Her last marriage was to George Ritchie. He stole from her, managed her badly, overworked her, and broke her, but she never left Ritchie. This is an unhappy life, an even messier and more difficult one than the melodrama of her work conveys. A lazy critic might assume a one-to-one correlation. Wynette was a performer, that she wrote little, or that she worked with other people's voices, meaning that we have to consider how our understanding of authorship needs to be widened and deepened. This book makes the case that Tammy Wynette matters because of the depth of her art, the formal qualities of her singing, and her ability to make melodramatic genius out of the mess of her life. However, it also argues that crafted presentation, work that is often considered silly, like costume or hair or home decor, is another way of making life into art. The book is about how to be a woman in a world which is hostile towards women, and about being working class in a world that is hostile about being working class. It is about the art of performing in presentation. The aim is not to forgive Wynette her monstrous moments, but to allow a complex vision to emerge, to restore a serious conversation about a serious artist. And we can do that only by talking about it all. Her hits and her career downturn, her marriages and her divorces, that weird kidnapping incident in the late 1970s, her wigs, and her friendship with the women who took care of them, her live shows and her funeral, and what she might have lied about in order to tell the deeper truth. It is also about her racial politics. So I genuinely struggled throughout this whole book about leaning into a single conclusion about any of the controversies of Wynette's life. I'm not sure if she got kidnapped or if she faked her own kidnapping. I'm not sure if she wrote the word whore on the walls in Franklin, Tennessee, or if her ex-husband Don Chappell did it, or if someone else did it. If I do not believe her, do I not believe the victim in general? If I trust Wynette's biographer, Jimmy McDonough, and his book on Wynette, Tragic Country Queen, then I don't trust her. I do trust that McDonough is an excellent researcher with a strong connection to Nashville insiders, and that he would know more than most. However, many of the men that McDonough interviewed had their own agenda. One is just at an oblique angle to Wynette's life. Believing Wynette may not be prioritizing McDonough's sources. Her close relationship to the National Enquirer, including possibly feeding them stories, means that the tabloid might have been more reliable. All of this centers the problems of Wynette. One's about gender or sexuality, about the domestic, about what work means in these contexts. This means taking seriously that which is dismissed in our misogynist culture. I also know that the artist does not that work which appears to be autobiographical cannot immediately be read that way. But it is also naive to assume that her life had nothing to do with the work being made about it. One of the ways that Wynette matters is the ambivalence of her life, and how that ambivalence inspires a career which includes ambitious, transparent, and haunted work that should also be taken seriously. Admitting that one does not know, or that one cannot know, that a life is too complex to be fully understood, does not preclude attempts at knowing. Wynette matters because of that ongoing ambivalence. Despite biography, the music should make its own argument. The first single, Apartment Number 9, uses the images of homemaking to discuss the failure of a marriage. Apartment Number 9 is less than 3 minutes and a harrowing example of domestic loneliness. It is everything that one expects from a Tammy Wynette song: the first-person storytelling, a tight narrative of isolation and loss, a prioritizing of women's pain over men's fecklessness, a voice that catches on the right space, and an arrangement which negotiates that space between lushness and spareness. It is a song created collectively, written along with honky-tonk singer Johnny Paycheck, played by Studio A pedal steel Pete Drake. It was recorded first by David Austin, and it was Wynette's first song, and the one which settled the themes for the rest of her life. There are other brilliant songs. The B-side, Your Good Girl's Gonna Go Bad, in an ironic reversal, imagines trapping a cheating man by making the heart a honky-tonk, funny and sexy and sad. The monumental Stand By Your Man, her signature song, rages against her will and was used against her both by the religious right as well as inelegant readers and mainstream critics. With a dozen songs with George Jones, called love songs, but mostly heartbreak songs, arguing in favor of heterosexual marriage, despite the obvious trauma. Her last big single, Womanhood, much like Tom T. Hall's Marjorie's of the Lincoln Park Inn, argues in favor of adultery, but this time with a strange subtext of piety and failure, the delicate interwoven harmonies in the trio albums she did with Dolly Parton and Loretta Lynn, reflecting the possibilities created by decades of friendship. She ends her career with the truly bizarre, Justified and Ancient, with the British hipster pranksters KLF, a dance hit in England and a breakthrough hit in America. That is partly why Tammy Wynette matters, that she reflects the domestic and social politics of women in America after the Second World War. The genius of her music is inarguable, but that genius exists with the creation of a public persona, its own art. There was also debates about each of these achievements, questions about how much of the writing she actually did, about how much she was under the influence of producer Billy Sherrill, who also wrote most of her work. Questions about how much she was in on the joke, about how bad she could be. There was also tens of thousands of words of discussions about Stand By Your Man, saying that she was dumb or naive, or that she was herself reactionary, and then it was an argument against feminism. Wynette fueled that argument when she rewrote the song in order to perform for George Wallace, the third-party segregationist politician. The intermingling of personal and private that marks her work with Jones often leads how difficult and abusive Jones was. The supposed greatest love story in country music history includes Jones hitting Wynette, threatening her with a gun, and then abandoning her for days at a time. Nashville sentimentality also underestimates the prodigiousness of their mutual drinking and pill taking. Even that last KLF single is a no problem. Is Wynette in on the joke? Is she being respected? Is she being mocked? If the music is significant and how we read the work is a mess of contradictory moments, then the question of how much of the biography is included in that music becomes front and center. Wynette made work about her life, but the involvement of Cherelle and other writers also means that there was some distance. She was not performing her own life, but creating a persona which appeared real, that her real heartbreaks have been burnished and faceted and carefully set, testifies to a craft that has been underrepresented, under-discussed. Still, it seems impossible to write about Wynette without writing about her life, and it is impossible to write about her life without thinking about it as the subject of the self-same crafting. So, thank you.
Do you want me to jump in next? Is that how okay, great. Gosh, thank you all so much for coming tonight. I'm really just so pleased to be able and honored to be able to speak to all of you, who many of whom scholarship in journalism has really deeply affected me and that I teach regularly. So thank you. So my book is called Queer Country. Country music is often said to be 3 chords and the truth, but the country music industry and even related musical genres have not been particularly friendly to queer or transgender musicians. Queer country musicians have developed a strategy of sincerity to engage critically with the postmodern deconstruction of essentialism, through which queer and trans experience has been understood as liberatory, but also dangerously rebellious, and yet continued desire for authenticity, in which their identities are accepted as real, civil, and accessible to a cisgender and straight audience. My book, Queer Country, argues that country and folk music's fraught framing of common personhood, authenticity, and otherness, concepts especially important to and actively debated among transgender and queer people, are appealing to craft stories of self, yet simultaneously invite critique of tradition. Queer Country identifies a meaningful development in modern queer and transgender life and contemporary vernacular music using ethnography, musical analysis, and historical methods to understand its contributions to changing notions of gender, genre, and tradition. So my chapters, Chapter 1 explores the centrality of sincerity to queer country music and the problem of sincerity's ties to essentialism, the notion that aspects of self are inherent. Authenticity is especially important to members of marginalized identity groups, creating a further complication with the postmodern critique of essentialism. This chapter identifies several key moments in queer country history to analyze these in the context of sincerity. The first is Lavender Country, the first out gay country album, which prioritized sharing truthful information about gay life. Then Canadian star Katie Lang, the first major country musician to seem explicitly queer, although she didn't come out during her country career, and whose sincerity was called into question due to her camp humor. And finally, an early 21st century take on sincerity by a transgender Canadian musician, Ray Spoon. Chapter 2 navigates the history of queer and trans artists' negotiations with country and related genres, from the Sweet Violet Boys in 1939 to Shelley Wright in 2021. Musical genres rely on particular expectations for credible identity performance, as well as for the message and use value of the music. A musician's choice of genre can prompt interpretations that place the ability to book shows and sell music at stake. Trans and queer musicians often have problems with genre identification. This chapter develops a theory of identity and genre as co-generative, and then delivers an alternative history of country and related music, narrating this genre history from the perspective of out queer and trans musicians. Finally, it analyzes 3 transgender musicians who transition gender and genre simultaneously. And I note that I don't draw distinct boundaries. around country and these related genres in this chapter or in the book in general, because that would simply continue the gatekeeping that has left many of these musicians out of mainstream country. And thus my book kind of willfully steps over those fences and so explores bluegrass and folk music, Americana roots. So chapter 3 addresses common themes that queer country musicians engage. Themes of journey across North America and journey to discover self that are part of mythology and history of country music, but also themes that describe gender and sexuality as journey. It also examines the importance of rurality and its presentations of community and self as grounded, connected, and organic. In navigating these themes, queer country musicians also bring up contemporary trans and queer political issues, including the trans narrative, the idea that all transgender people's experiences follow a certain journey, and marginalized people's assimilation versus the idea of revolution. The chapter explores the country music of Amy Ray from the Indigo Girls, Ray Spoon, actor/model, Joe Stevens, and the soundtrack of the film Transamerica, including Dolly Parton's Oscar-nominated song Travelin' Through. Transamerica crafts a transgender character's identity through a country music soundtrack that humanizes her character after a century of cruel trans stereotypes in film, and yet uses her whiteness against other characters' racialized otherness. Chapter 4 attends to concerns of appropriation and misrepresentation. This chapter explores non-binary musician Ray Spoon's Stolen Song and the music video that inspired it, Arcade Fire's We Exist, engaging the history of folk and country music's impacts on North Americans' understanding of identity, and more broadly, the questions of artistic sincerity in the context of otherness, accusations of misrepresentation, and questions of national belonging. Chapter 5, the final chapter, discusses 3 cisgender male country musicians successful in the latter part of the second decade of the 21st century, who used drag, masking, and cowboy costuming as strategies for developing queer sincerity in the face of a history of exclusion from the mainstream industry. In 2020, Trixie Mattel, Orville Peck, and Lil Nas X's embrace of gay camp humor, fashion, and irony has allowed them to forge a sincerity with their audience, one that is framed through the understanding of postmodern critique of essentialism and its ties to identity and musical categories, and one that follows in the footsteps of the truthfulness of early pioneer of gay country and activism, Patrick Haggerty. Their performances and successes offer an important comparison with 3 important but less visible current female queer country musical acts that prioritize unmasked and female collaboration to support this work. So I think I'll stop there, and I'm happy to answer questions. Thanks.
Am I up now? Okay. Sorry, I'm still mastering these earbud Hanukkah presents. But thank you guys for having me. That was so fascinating to hear from both of you. My book, Her Country, is the story of the past 20 years of country music through the lens of Maren Morris, McKee Guyton, and Casey Musgraves, their peers and inspirations in their paths to stardom and their battles against a deeply embedded boys club, as well as their efforts to transform the genre into a more inclusive place for all, and not just white men in trucker hats. It's a narrative story, so it doesn't particularly focus on one artist per chapter. It just is a linear story from 1999 through present time. And I chose to focus on that time period to kind of be able to take a kind of very focused look on what's happening in country now. And I also thought there's also been a lot of great work on women that came before them, but it sort of tries to take a bird's eye view of everything a little bit, but it's mostly focused on Maren, Casey, and McKee. So I'll just read a little bit from my adapted introduction. The story begins in 1999, the year that Shania Twain, reigning superstar, took home the Entertainer of the Year trophy at the CMA Awards. The biggest hit on country radio was Faith Hill's Breathe. Shelley Wright, an artist who will later be pushed out of the genre for coming out as lesbian, was enjoying the success of her song Single White Female. The Chicks are one of the most successful bands not only in country music, but well beyond. They just played feminist touring festival Lilith Fair, with fiddle player Marty McGuire fiercely wielding her instrument in a crop top, already angering the Nashville institutions to the point that the trio's eventual expulsion for speaking out against the president would come as a relief to some, not just a surprise. Country music was built on women like Casey, Marin, and Mickey. The signature guitar sound of the genre originates with the playing of Mother Maybelle Carter, and with so many legends, Dolly Parton, Katie Wells, Loretta Lynn, Patsy Cline, Bobby Gentry, Sammy Smith, Tammy Wynette, Tanya Tucker, Linda Martell. But while the Outlaws get the fame for being renegades, it was Loretta Lynn who wrote lyrics about taking the birth control pill and was subsequently banned from most of country radio. It was Dolly Parton who wrote of poverty and suicide, Tanya Tucker who sang about sex and dressed like it too. It was the oft-forgotten Rose Maddox who created a subset of hillbilly Western. It was Linda Martell as the first Black woman to chart a country song and sing at the Grand Ole Opry. It was Reba who built an empire, Martina McBride who cracked a hit with a song about escaping abuse and became an advocate for domestic abuse survivors in its wake. It was Winona Judd who used horns on her solo project. It was Shania Twain who took her music global. It was Kitty Wells and her Honky Tonk Angels. It was Priscilla Renee, whose songs were country enough for Carrie Underwood and Miranda Lambert to cut themselves, but considered too R&B when she released an excellent album under her own name. It was all the Black women who we don't have songs to talk about here because they were never allowed to make them. They were all country and changed country, whether Music Row agreed. Cut to 2021, when women are only played on country radio as little as 10% of the time, to when country music went from being synonymous with powerful women to truck riding bro country crooners, to when a rule that you don't play women back to back is taken as gospel, or that it's widely and incorrectly believed that women don't want to hear other women singers, to a world where artists like Casey Musgraves sell out arenas but barely score a single second of airplay, to when women are likened by one country radio consultant to tomatoes in the salad of men, which became known in the industry as Tomatogate, to when Black artists, especially Black women, are virtually non-existent, not just on country radio, but in the industry as a whole. And the story of how country's premier and foundational instrument, the banjo, came from Africa is all but buried in history. To when you can be penalized for speaking your truth in a genre that's supposed to be built on it. But also to a world where these women are infinitely bigger live draws than most of their male counterparts, having massive pop crossovers like Marin's The Middle, winning armfuls of Grammys like Casey, making country music history like Mickey, launching their own passion projects, charities, and clothing lines, and taking complete control of their own careers on their own terms. Women are rarely perceived country enough anyway, to pop, to indie, to anything. So they're left with no path to but continually, in the words of Casey Musgraves, follow their own arrows. Now, women are flourishing outside of how country will allow them to. But this isn't just a story of sexism in music. It's a story of America, of how misogyny and class permeate the most basic of threads and how power supersedes decency and art in the minds and hearts of those who should know better. It's a story of triumph and how to pave your own way in an impossible world. It's a story about how politics, corporate greed, and the decisions of our political leaders trickle down to our most precious art forms, of how the oppressed can also be the oppressor, especially if you're white, and how whiteness became country music's most historical currency. It's a story of how country music has used its gender wars as the cover for its deep embedded desires to preserve and weaponize that whiteness. It's the story of a young girl growing up in Texas named Casey Musgraves, who wore cats bigger than her body and wrote her first song at the age of 9, and who would go on to win Grammy Awards, sell out arenas, and change the face of the genre. With songs like Follow Your Arrow, she would open the door for LGBTQIA+ artists, going from playing George W. Bush's inaugural as a child to praising weed and psychedelics as a grown woman. But it's also the story of the genre's true queer pioneers, like Follow Your Arrow co-writer and Grammy-nominated artist Brandy Clark, who may not be a household name like Casey, but whose work and visibility offers an intergenerational imprint. It's the story of Maren Morris, who packed soul and grit into her version of country music as early as a preteen, jockeying with men 5 times their age for space on the Dallas-Fort Worth bar and honky-tonk stages, as well as Texas regional radio, who broke the mold in Nashville to speak her mind politically and do things her own way, joining with Brandi Carlile, Amanda Shires, and Natalie Hemby in the Highwaymen. And she did it all on occasion with the embrace of country radio, baking 3 #1 singles on Billboard's country airplay. It's the story of Mickey Guyton, who grew up on the back roads, climbing trees and singing in church, and who finally saw her own definition of success when she stopped trying to get country music to like her as they thought she should be and became the artist she is, singing her truth and opening up the genre to finally include anything but the white norm. Her anthem, Black Like Me, released after the killing of George Floyd at the hands of police in 2020, would earn her accolades and open doors. But her main mission became how she could prop that door open for anyone else who wanted to come through. It's the story of so many women. And while this book focuses on 3 major label country stars, there are countless female artists in the genre who have pioneered, cracked open, and transformed country music with their craft. Yet this is not the story of all women in country music, because there's so many of them that never made it to Nashville and never felt welcome because of the color of their skin or who they loved or the language they were born speaking, or who left the industry because of sexual harassment or abuse. This book should include their stories and their voices. And this book is for them mostly to show them that there is a place in a world that is trying to shift the paradigm for them, but never denying the truth. This book is the story of how country music's women fought back against systems designed to keep them down. How women like Casey, Marin, and Mickey and others reinvented the rules to find their place in an industry stacked against them. About how they've ruled the century when it comes to artistic output. About how women can and do belong in country music, even if their voices aren't being played as loudly on the radio. Because art and truth sings the loudest of all. That's what I got.
All right, everybody. But before we open up to questions from the crowd in general, which please do put those in the chat. We'd love to have a little section where the 3 of you talk to each other a bit, and so maybe you can pose each other questions and open up the conversation a little bit that way. Stacy, I think you can just unmute and get started if you have a starting point.
Little bit of a shit-stirring question for Marissa.
Yes.
But I think it's something we've been struggling with as sort of queer or women writers about country music who are queer. And sort of at the beginning of this was talking a little bit about Ray Lynn, and I think this is one of the things I'm struggling with via Tammy as well, is how do we write about people who weaponize their marginalized position as women to do a disservice to other communities? If we're having a serious conversation about women in country music, how do we handle the conversation about sort of Wynette and George Wallace or Ray Lynn and Turning Point? And yeah, so that's a giant question, and so it's probably too big for like 2 minutes, so I'm sorry about that, but it's just been weighing on my head.
Sorry, I like keep stuffing things in my ear like a mess. But I mean, I'm really glad you asked that question, because I think that was one of the things I thought about most when I was figuring out how I wanted to approach my book, and figuring out who I wanted to focus on. Because I think that, I mean, for a really long time, we talked about sort of the problem of women in country music without acknowledging that whatsoever. And talking about, you know, how someone like Ray Lynn, I watched only part of that video, but for anyone who hadn't seen it, I think she in the same sentence or same video says that there's no racism in country music because she hadn't experienced it as a white woman. And that acknowledges the problem with gender disparity in the airwaves. Admittedly, I haven't really watched the whole thing, but I think I have the gist of it. And that sort of like sums up so many women in country music and the approach that they take to talking about, you know, fighting for themselves first. Like if you look at the top 20 songs, I can't remember if it was Mediabase or Billboard, but it was all men, and then the last one was Gabby Barrett, you know, at number 20, coming in at number 20. And of course she's going to do anything she can to stay in that position, because we've already, you know, we've marginalized women, and so they're not going to, you know, those women that have sort of gotten those spots have a choice, right? They can decide to do something bigger with their position and help widen country music, or they can do anything they can to play to the status quo to keep exactly where they are. I don't know what exactly like Ray Lynn's motivations are, but we could probably figure it out a little bit. But I think it's, you know, it's a really big question, but it's one that is really essential to have when we figure out how to talk about these women in, you know, the most accurate way, I guess.
It seems to me that delving into controversy and not shying from it is important in anyone's scholarship. So, you know, it seems to lead to better questions and better arguments. I mean, one way that that some of my musicians open things up is sort of through this desire for voicing suffering in country music, you know, and how finally gay men's experience of that like seemed an authentic topic to discuss, and Black women's experiences with it, you know, seemed authentic to discuss finally, and you know, that finally sort of registered in a way, using country's, you know, sort of stick of authenticity.
We keep talking amongst each other.
I realized I've put you on the spot a little bit because I guess you guys didn't plan for this section. But yeah, if there's any other questions you want to pose to each other, that's fine. And if not, we can start moving to the crowd. So, but I'll give you just a minute to think about that.
I mean, how did the both of you, for me, I started this book right before the pandemic, or I, you know, sort of solidified that I would be writing it. Obviously, it was kind of years before that in the making, but started it right around in March 2020, which is great, really great timing. I love that. But, you know, so much obviously happened since then in country music. And how did both of you did you find yourself, you know, paying close attention to the movements in real time kind of in country as you were writing, or did you kind of have to silo yourself away from the, you know, fast evolving nature of the genre's culture?
If you want to sing, Shana, I didn't want to. I'm really struggling with this, like about being non-binary and being queer and being a country fan feels so weirdly toxic right now, that I was working through this and I was just like, does Tammy Wynette matter at this moment? Is this an argument that I can make that is ethical considering her politics? How do I construct being a country music fan in the midst of this? And I'm not naive. I know that this is the history of country music, and this is a genre that's really important to me. But no, I was like in this at a moment, I was like, I'm still struggling with whether this is ethical or not, and I don't know if I have an answer to that yet. I'm writing through it, but yeah, I'm totally.
Yeah, that's a conundrum. I mean, I had the opposite experience, of course, since I'm focused on these marginalized figures that have suddenly become, much more visible and heard, which has been overwhelming and terrifying, in addition to being up for tenure. So yeah, I started going to shows without realizing it was a book project, and without realizing it was even necessarily about country music. And I guess around like 2013, I knew for sure it was a book project and it was about country music. But my whole discovery process of like who to write about, for a while was very difficult because, people weren't necessarily out, and there weren't articles or lists or playlists, or autobiographies, or songs that were very outwardly queer or trans. So I was sort of digging around and meeting people, going to shows and asking about other people they knew. And then suddenly, it's really exploded. And so, yeah, I've had to hurry up and, try to capture some of the excitement and, visibility and what some of that might mean. And get it out there before it was irrelevant. Yeah, so that was exciting but terrifying.
Yeah, I had some of the similar experiences going through this. I mean, I struggled for a while figuring out where to end the book because it feels so much like it's still, I mean, it is very much emotion. Any subject is, obviously, but specifically what I chose to write on, and like the evolving nature of country music as something still very much in progress. It was difficult to figure out where to end it, and kind of like, you can't just write to be continued ... and like, I mean, I guess you could, but I didn't want to do that. So I had a lot of similar like sort of moments where I had to ask myself what I wanted to be doing with what I was writing. And I think in that sense that the work ended up changing in what it turned out to be versus maybe a little bit what I pitched. And I think that's a really good thing. I'm really glad for that. Because I think it asked harder questions than maybe I had set out to ask. And I mean, that's always your hope anyway. So, but there were moments when, you're writing about someone and you're asking similar questions, I think, that you were taking with Tammy, and being like, is this a person that I even feel good writing about? And like, and because I'm making that choice, it's the story as I want to tell it, so I can decide who I want to write about, but I can't rewrite history. So it was difficult. I had similar struggles for sure.
Okay, we have some questions rolling in the chat now, and so this might be a good time to turn over. I'm going to go briefly out of order because Holly says that she has to leave in a few minutes. So I thought I'd ask Holly George Warren to jump in with her question first.
Carl, I was thinking you were going to read it for me. Just off, I enjoyed all three presentations, and I can't wait to read your book, y'all's books. I am from North Carolina, so I can say y'all. Anyway, I've thought about Tammy Wynette a lot over the years. I've seen her numerous times, and I did get to interview her one time a few years before she died. So my question, or just throwing it out there, an idea for conversation, discussion, it seems to me as if Tammy Wynette created a victim persona for herself from the beginning of her career, both through the persona in her songs, the protagonist, but also through her life situation, which she made public from her father's early death, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? She maintained that persona throughout, though she attained power through her success. On the one occasion I interviewed her, she was very assertive and very proud of that power. So my question, just as other country artists, going back to the singing brakeman, of course, Jimmie Rodgers in the 1920s, created a persona, should Tammy's guys be seen in a different light? I'm just throwing that out there for conversation, discussion. Or disagreement.
Oh, this is messy. That's a really hard thing with Tammy, right? Like, you know, I grew up with a second wave feminist mom who was really good at making sure that I knew how power was constructed. And of course it's a persona, right? Like everything is a persona. And one of the things that frustrates me in conversations about country music is that we don't admit that authenticity is a performative act, that constructing the authentic self is an act of persona building, whatever that looks like. And the more authentic a person is, the better they are at constructing a persona. All of that said, like, you just get frustrated. Like, I'm a distance right from Wynette generationally. And so you get frustrated with this sort of like just spectacularly bad choices she made throughout her career. And then you end up sort of working apologies too in the same sense. I don't know if this answers it. I've been thinking a lot about opioids, and she had an opioid addiction, but like she had 200, 300 shows a year for 20 years in like 60-pound gowns and heels. Like, that's painful. Like, she had dozens of surgeries. That's painful. Like, I don't know if that makes sense. Like, there's obviously like logical consequences for the construction of persona and authenticity. So we can be good post-structuralists and say, this is all performative and this is all sort of game playing and authenticity, but it doesn't mean that the game playing and authenticity or the construction of persona doesn't have legitimate and explicit corporeal consequences. And I think that that's one of the central clusters of sort of things I'm trying to do with the book is like, yes, this is not real, but the not real of this results in the realness of it. I don't know if that made sense.
Yeah, you have to wonder if she'd lived, would she have like maybe evolved as a persona, you know, because I interviewed around the time of the Moo Moo song where, you know, in the video where she's this goddess and everything, and she loved it. She was so excited talking about that and wanting, I think she'd gone to London and done shows and she loved that whole thing. So you have to wonder if she had been able to stay with us, if she would have evolved, if she'd gotten off the opioids too, if she'd be able to evolve into that more, you know, goddess, powerful strength persona, survivor persona kind of thing. It's just, you know, it's so complicated. My sympathy goes out to you kind of trying to like sort this all out in a book, but I can't wait to read it. So thank you. And I'm going to watch the rest of the conversation on YouTube because I have to split, sadly. But thanks so much, everybody. Thanks, Carl, for letting me go. I really enjoyed it. Keep up the good work, everybody. Bye.
Thanks, Holly. And so I'll go back into the order in the chat now. Cal, you were first up.
Sorry, I thought you were going to read them too. I was very impressed the other day by an essay I got in my Twitter feed from Tressie McMillan Cottom about the Jason Isbell series of concerts with Black women artists, and she kind of deconstructs all the different traditions that they touch upon. Obviously, she's also making some claims about the erasure of the contributions of Blackness into this American music form that, as all of you mentioned one way or another, has been careful to define itself, at least in this contemporary age, as sort of the opposite, if you will, of Blackness. It's the antidote to hip hop. It's the antidote to these other forms, and is the true original American music. When, if you go back far enough, you see all the connective tissue. So I was just, again, I was intrigued and impressed by all of the contributions you guys made in this, and I too look forward to all the books. But I'm just wondering if either you saw that essay or had any thoughts about what Jason Isbell's intervention might mean in the conversations you're having in your work.
I can start on that one. I actually interviewed her for my book. So she gave some really valuable insight into a lot of the conversations I think that we're having here already, not to go back to authenticity again, but that was one thing that I talked about with her. And how, and if you look at for the purposes of my book, I look at Casey, Marin, and Mickey most closely. I look at them closely, but they're not the only people I talk about in the book. But it's interesting because Mickey is the most sort of authentically country of them all. If you go by sort of the traditional, she grew up on dirt roads in Texas, and she's religious, and she sings songs that are fit for country radio way more than Marin and Mickey. And it's interesting that, and no one uses, well, not including people here, but the people that, don't think Mickey fits in country music for whatever reason will try to make this case that she's not authentic or as authentic as some dude who, whatever the current signal of authenticity is at the time, whether it's a cowboy hat or trucker hat or whatever kind of hat and jeans, whatever that is, it changes back and forth. But we talked about that, and we also talked a lot about, the marginalization of white women as the most powerful tool to help keep Nashville white, and preserve that whiteness in country music. Because, white women artists are very busy fighting for themselves. And she talked about that, I know, in the Twitter Spaces conversation after that article, which I thought was amazing. And yeah, I think it's a frontier that people have only sort of talked about in a more mainstream way in like the past year. But it's a really important part of this whole conversation. And I do, sorry, I'm like a mess with these stupid things. As for the Jason Isbell thing, I mean, I think that comes into part of my book at the end. And I think it's a really important moment, as she does, because it sort of signals that there's this whole need to build a whole new system. The Nashville and country music and the gatekeepers of Music Row aren't going to change in the way that anyone wants them to. I mean, maybe that's a little bit pessimistic of me, but maybe it's realist, I guess. And he's, you can kind of pick a side on either side of the fault line these days, I guess. You can do what Jason Isbell's doing and using his platform to acknowledge harm and take a bigger role in pushing the genre forward or creating a new space, or you can do what, Ray Lynn is doing, I guess, and doubling down. Don't really feel bad for shitting on Ray Lynn repeatedly. It's fine. We can just turn it over to that. But yeah, I mean, that was an amazing essay, and her Dolly essay is yeah, we have this inspiring a lot of my writing right by here at my desk. So that is a long answer to your question, I guess. Rambling a little bit.
I do worry. I've been talking a lot, Shana, so I didn't mean to. I do worry that as much as I love Isbell and as much as I like Isbell's politics, that he's getting kudos I'm struggling with it. This is just me struggling throughout this entire thing, right? For doing this sort of like welcoming act, but also like I don't think that lineup would have existed without Isabel, and
yeah,
I don't know how to balance that match.
I mean, for
But I
me,
think, can I just say, I think, this is a conversation we're having in my world, which is not about music history at all. But, as a person who is trying to disrupt spaces, I'm looking for the so-called conspirators. And I think the power, to the extent that they're willing to let power be leveraged. I bought about 10 albums after reading that essay, and not one of them was by Jason Isbell. So I do think there's a space for that person who can leverage their position and is a conspirator rather than a simple ally or a sponsor.
right.
yeah.
That's definitely true of what's been happening with the people in my book. I mean, the besides the explosion of attention around some of these marginalized people, the other thing that really impacted my book was the election of Donald Trump. And sort of like what I thought might happen to some of these musicians, is terrifying. But one thing that certainly it put pressure on some of these mainstream country musicians who despised Donald Trump and what he stood for, and had sort of came out, like straight cisgender people, especially white men, felt a lot of pressure, I think, to say something and kind of out themselves. So I sort of saw that as part of the reaction to Donald Trump, and that obviously it was going to turn off some country fans, but win some other country fans.
Great. I think James Barker, you were up next.
Yeah. Hi, everyone. I just want to say to all of the panelists, I'm really looking forward to all of your books. And I really enjoyed all of your presentations. And Shana, your essay, Transamericana, has been such a vital resource for this area of the PhD that I'm working on right now. So I just want to say a big thank you for that as well. So my question, I guess, most directly relates to Shana, but I think it speaks to everyone's about authenticity, because it's in some ways both in pop music studies, but also just around kind of country music. There's so many different reasons to almost not use authenticity, but there is, I think, you have such a compelling argument for the value of, I guess, reclaiming authenticity. So I just wondered what you all thought about the extent to which authenticity can play an important role, particularly for Black and queer artists, but how the dangers of the sort of gatekeeping can be addressed.
My chapter 4 gets into that a little bit, as the musician Ray Spoon wrote a book about how songwriting, and sort of like suggested, if you haven't experienced something, you can't write a song about it. And I think that that's something that a number of young progressive people feel right now, around sort of like life and art and activism, whereas a lot of artists and composers are just like, what are you talking about? Like, that's so incredibly limiting, all these calls around appropriation. So that's where I think the authenticity thing gets maybe the most complicated, is that particular issue. And sort of you can't write a story about someone else and sing that song. I mean, do I have the answer? I guess I wrote about it a bit, drawing on, scholarship about how culture is hybrid, like that, like this quest for, essence, and the pure origins, which seems so important in some of these genres, folk and country, is a myth, that there is no original, just like there is no original, source of any culture, and so, that's where I think Ray Spoon is wrong, about appropriation and being too cautious and sort of leaning into the, cancel culture moment, in a way that I think is sort of dangerous. I was just reading Mary Gaucher's terrific autobiography, and hearing about her songwriting project with veterans, like that. And how would that work, if like she didn't get to sort of like, help someone else tell their story? I mean, we'd miss out on a lot of, really poignant, interesting music and art and storytelling. I mean, maybe this gets back to the last question and conversation in a way too, right? Because like, at least in this moment, we do have some of the most marginalized, most unlistened to musicians finally getting some stage time and presence, which helps a bit in them telling their own stories rather than being sung about in a very stereotyped, romanticized way. So at least, there is that also happening simultaneously.
I mean, I think we could probably have like a 2-hour conversation about this if we wanted to. But I mean, I obviously address authenticity when it comes to women and queer musicians in my book in different ways. But I mean, it's really interesting watching how people are sort of grasping onto it as, and this isn't even something I really delve into too much in my book, but even seeing like, if you look at a band like Dan and Shay and look at the language, the way that people talk about them to sort of disparage their art usually has, sort of this it's sort of discrimination disguised as authenticity arguments. And like, and I think that's something that country music can't really shake, is that they'll be like, it's always this kind of coded language about not being authentic, but really what you want to say is you're uncomfortable with them presenting a little bit more feminine than you like, or you're uncomfortable with the woman taking, being a little bit stronger in her convictions than you like, or you're afraid of what Brandy Clark is saying and it makes you uncomfortable, so you're gonna go after her authenticity for some reason as a fallback. It's like always the fallback. Same with Mickey, like she's just not authentically country, like, and that means in Mickey's case almost always that she's not white, and but we never, it just is the most nagging, insufferable part of country music discourse, with maybe the except, in addition to talking about the genre as a whole and what is or isn't country music. But it's it could go long on that one. But
there's this great quote that's either Oscar Levant or George Kaufman about how if you scrape the false tinsel of Hollywood, you'll get to the real tinsel underneath. And that's all I want for Nashville. It's just to uncover the real tinsel.
I think this moment is a really good one to go to Francesca's question, which I think comes very directly following on what Marissa was just saying. So Francesca.
Hi, everybody. Thank you. I've really enjoyed this conversation, and just listening and just thinking about like the concept of queer futures and how writers like Jose Munoz kind of think about how queerness has this aspect of mourning or loss or kind of recognition of erasure kind of built into it. And I was thinking about Shana's comment about the strategy of kind of opening up genre sometimes in order to allow these other voices in and see the picture more fully, and really just kind of wanting to know how you all see kind of the queer future of country. Like is there, like, what are the stakes, I guess, of hanging on to a country beyond a historic descriptor, and just your thoughts on that. And it's just something I'm also always wrestling with too. So
I have a thought. I'm just trying to figure out how to phrase this without getting in too much trouble. I don't think that there will be a queer future for country. I think that one of the things about, we're talking about queer futurality, it has to include queer bodies and queer sex. And I think that we won't get a queer future for country until country's longing and desire includes that sort of corporeal reality. And I think that's really important. I'm thinking about T.J. Osborne coming out, which I'm grateful for, I'm thankful for, and then thinking about the nostalgia of his coming out single, and about how unironic that is compared even to their work previously. Yeah, I think that that's one of the things, conversations we have to have continually is, and like, if you look at Haggerty, right, like his big single was quite big single. Like it was not a big single. It sold 70 copies, right? And like dances in Spokane.
1,000.
But it's crying these cocksucking tears, right? Like there's no queer futurality for country until something like Crying These Cocksucking Tears can exist on country radio next to whatever song Luke Bryan is singing about fucking in a hotel room. Like, and I feel that way about Brandy Clark too. Like, I don't know. You can put that on T.J. Osborne's next press release.
Yeah, in a way, I mean, it does seem like, people are, the queer musicians that I wrote about are marginal. Their successes are in Americana. Although recently, Brandi Carlile got pushed by the Grammys into pop rather than Americana, which she protested. But still, I think that falls nicely into Marissa's territory around how the woman in country can never quite be country enough. So Americana or pop, either one, that's sort of, fine territory for women. But yeah, I guess somebody like Orville Peck, who does bring some of that corporeality of queer desire, into his music and music videos, has never really tried to be country. Exactly, not mainstream, certainly. In a way that Shelley Wright wants to get back into and can't seem to get back into.
Yeah, I mean, modern country, to begin with, I mean, you brought up Luke Bryan, and he sings about sex like he's a 12-year-old who just learned about it in a comic book, sorry, but he calls it knocking boots. It's cute and it's a play on words, and country music does that, but it's the truth. No one's convincing me that they're having hot sex in country music, except for maybe Miranda Lambert. And in terms of what's on country radio, I'm not talking broader than that. And I think Marin, and that was something that interested me a lot about Marin, is that she sings about sex and desire like someone that you actually believe has desire. Yeah, absolutely, Sam Hunt. And that was something that I talk about. I mean, she Marin did an interview with Playboy where she talks about, you know, how it's really important in a relationship for your partner to go down on you regularly. And like for country music, that is like, I couldn't believe that she said that, because in country music, you're supposed to talk about sex like a 12-year-old now. I mean, we're not talking about Conway Twitty here, who is pretty sexy, but on country radio, like I said, it's, you know, so there needs to be a, you know, and I think some of that is done out of fear of keeping anything but straight sex out of the conversation. Like if we keep it super PG-13, not even PG-13, we keep it like kindergarten, then we don't have to talk about anything else. You know, we can't let any other conversations of sexuality or sex or desire in if we just keep it like really cute and church and all that. But, yeah. Sorry, Luke Bryan. I'm sure you're fine.
I'd like to ask Gus Stadler to ask his question now.
Hi, I too really have enjoyed this session, so thank you all, and I'm really looking forward to the books. My question has to do with well, Shana, you mentioned camp in relation to Katie Lang, and I guess part of this comes from just being like a child of the 90s, but I'm just sort of thinking about how in another era like the 90s, like there was this sort of deep connection between at least some segment of queer culture and country music and camp. And I'm thinking of also like in relation to Tammy Wynette, like the Lyle Lovett cover of Stand By Your Man. That was such a like a big, like a song you would hear in gay bars all the time. And so I'm wondering if there's like what you all, or I guess it's mostly Stacy and Shana, but think does camp exist, or is there something like that today? And I guess I'm also wondering, is there a relationship between, or what is the relationship between camp and the racial politics of country music? Like, is there some way, I guess what I'm suspecting is that there's some kind of, you know, maybe not endemic or essential, but some association between whiteness and camp that makes it more complicated at the present moment, or more problematic, I guess, at the present moment. And yeah, or I mean, not that it wouldn't have always been problematic, but in relation to some of the artists that you're bringing up, and artists of color, etc.
There is a chapter in my book on Katie Lang called Camp. Oh, not on Katie Lang, sorry, on Tammy Wynette. Yeah, you can't write about Tammy Wynette without talking about camp. Sorry, go ahead, Chen.
Yeah, so I mean, Katie Lang, yeah, I mean, is obviously campy. And, you know, it was fabulous. You know, and she sort of looks back on some of her country music and says, like, you know, it may have been performance art, but at the same time, she talks about how she had a serious love for country music and a real honest relationship with it. And I guess to get back to Marissa talking about the way that, you know, authenticity claims sort of allow the country gatekeeping to be discriminatory, to sort of hide discriminatory language. I think that like that was very much true about the language around Katie Lang. Like, you know, I don't think she has a serious relationship to country music. She's not honest, Like what they wanted her to be honest about was like her sexuality. You know, they thought like it was really problematic that she was vegan, like that kind of, you know, Canadian, that kind of thing. Like it wasn't really about her, you know, humor. But I guess, you know, I get into discussing the sort of interesting juxtaposition between honky tonk and Nashville sound in relation to her music, and like the relationship of sincerity and humor in those musics, and the way that, you know, some of that humor was shed in kind of trying to find a more mainstream audience for country music. And so it seemed weird that she was like, you know, sort of reinvesting in some of that. Yeah, and she, you know, one of the things that she would joke about, you know, trying, like pretending that she was about to come out, you all know that I'm a, you know, and then she'd, you know, she'd say, you know, Lyle Lovett fan, you know, instead of saying I'm a lesbian, you know, so, but, you know, that's also a very campy choice anyway, Lyle Lovett. But yeah, I guess there's a lot of seriousness today. There's a lot of like earnestness, you know, in this music, like, and some of my students were like, my sort of millennial students were just like, you know, sort of put off by it, you know, like, it's too sincere. Like, why are you writing about sincerity? You know? Yeah. And certainly that it can be a problem, some of this. I mean, I don't know. I need a second to think about it. I mean, this is a great question. I don't know that camp is always, you know, endemically associated with whiteness or not. I mean, I think, you know, there's a lot of great Black camp that, but yeah, I suppose in country music, it's a problem because it just seems like you know, a shameful stereotype, one that gets into the hee-haw, you know, kind of hillbilly, you know, what Nadine Hubbs talks about, like Jed face, you know, the kind of yeah, hillbilly stereotypes. I mean, so people all seem to have like I am a country gal, or like I am a country guy, and like sort of rural, you know, stuff is, you know, all part of their, you know, song and video and stuff, but not the humor part of that exactly.
Well, and then I mean, like sometimes there's like accidental camp when I'm performing gender, where it's just unbearably funny. Like Small Town Throwdown is like essentially a camp text done by butch men who are performing gender better than any queen has ever managed, and they don't quite know it, right? Like, you can't look at some of that sort of homosociality of the bro country and not feed it as sort of homosocial and having the potential homoeroticism and also be super camp. Like, but I also would not want to tell Brantley Gilbert that in person.
Please do. I want to talk about that so much. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
No, that's what I meant, right? Like if camp is sort of a relational strategy, or camp is a way of interpreting text, then and it's frustrating that also mildly that like Justin Moore has just become too earnest to camp now.
I mean, it's a moment of real shift in like the demographics, I think, of like queerness and transness. Like, so maybe like there's a lot of people who aren't familiar with that history or style of engagement, and like earnestness is sort of their language. And like reaching out to some of these people is like an important, you know, move for some of these artists. So, but they might not get some of that. Whereas they're just like, you know, earnest activist, you know, and ready to police your language on, you know, social media.
I'm going to jump in here and get this last question in, which Jody Rosen asked me to read for him because he can't do it from home. Very open-ended question. Stand By Your Man is a fascinating song that obviously, so this has come up already, a little discussion, rippled through popular culture for decades through cover versions, parodies, quote unquote, deconstructions, etc. Also, as Stacy mentioned, there's been a pretty robust critical conversation about it over the years. I'm curious to hear Stacy say a bit more about how they're tackling the song. And also curious to hear from Shana and Marissa if they want to chime in, since I think it's fair to say that Stand By Your Man connects in various ways to the themes they explore in their books. So we'll try to keep this a little bit tight if we can, because we don't want to go too far over, but I wanted to get that in there.
Okay, so I will say 5 things very quickly about Stand By Your Man. First of all, I think that it opens to multiple readings, and I think that people aren't particularly good at recognizing a multiplicity of discourses about it. Second, I think it is an absolutely beautiful song. I think that David Cantwell's conversation about it in his Heartaches by the Numbers takes it seriously. And David's here, but we have to take it seriously as a text. Absolutely. And I think that sort of camp readings are impossible without taking it seriously. And I think one of the frustrating things, for example, about some covers of it, like Lyle Lovett's, I don't like Lyle Lovett's cover, and Co and I've had this fight about this as well, like very gentle disagreement, that I think that he doesn't take Wynette seriously. I think that he treats it like a joke. And I think we have to, and that's for us, I think that we have to be very careful about taking Wynette as a joke, because I think one of the reasons why I wrote this book and one of the reasons why I seriously considered this book was I'm very urban, I'm non-binary, I'm queer. I grew up in the prairies. I'm sort of an old school prairie faggot, but I wasn't allowed to take part in the sort of rituals of domesticity. And so part of my act in this book is a consideration of the domestic as a serious act, as a domestic as a serious way of doing culture. And Stand By Your Man is a way of doing that. Fifth, and then I'll be very, very quick. It's also dangerous politically. I think it's dangerous politically in the way, for example, how Wynette used it to get George Wallace elected, reelected. I think that it's dangerous in the way that Hillary Clinton used it to denigrate working class, especially working class women and working class domestic labor. I think politically it is very easy to be very lazy about it as a text. And I think that does an active disservice to it as one of the great works of popular art in the 20th century. Deep breath.
I was just going to jump in there and say that, to get back to Gus's question about camp too, what you're saying, Stacy, about, you have to note the seriousness in camp as well. And that's sort of part of the conversation in my book too. And I wanted to turn you on to Ray Spoon's cover called Stand By Your Trans. So.
Yeah, I mean, I know we're at the end here, but I think the only sort of way you both covered this really well, so I don't have too much to add, but the way I touch on that song in this book a little bit is I think it's a good example of how criticism and sort of cultural thought about country music is missing a lot of nuance that can be really harmful, especially when we're talking about women. In the case of my book, when we're talking about Black women, people fall on either side, and either it's like this, sort of destructive song, or it's this torch carrying song for the, domesticity, and there's nothing in between. And both can be really harmful. And I think a lot of times there's the way certain segments of people, of critics outside of country music often talk about country music can sort of reinforce the stereotypes that exist while trying to sort of simultaneously speak down on them or deconstruct them. So that's kind of where I intersect with that song a little bit. My favorite recent cover of that is Cassie Ashton. She's kind of still in the up and coming phase, but when I saw her perform it, I don't know, maybe 5 years ago, she did like a really sultry kind of version, and then in the middle of it sort of stopped and was like, I'm sorry, Tammy, I love you, but I don't play that way. And it was interesting to see her kind of like simultaneously engage and wink at what the song was doing for her at once. But yeah.
That's great. Thank you, everyone. Before we reach the half-hour mark, I'll thank all of our presenters. And just remind everybody that next week we're on Tuesday instead of Monday, talking about mainstreams and commodification with Liz Poliski and Alexandra Vesey, sorry. And yeah, thank you all. It's been great. Thank you all for your questions and for this great conversation. And we'll see you next week.